this is an act of barbarism, which I think has really shocked the world.
The Australian Prime Minister himself pivoted immediately towards committing to cracking down on the far right. I mean, unless Islamism is now defined as the far right, which is reasonable, but it's almost certainly not what he intended to say.
We should look at the sources of all of this. Porous borders and no concern given to that. Multiculturalism constantly accentuating difference and kind of fueling Islamist grievance narrative.
The powers that be would rather people not talk about it. They're more worried about us complaining about it too much, looking back in anger. Hello and welcome to the Spiked podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked. I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined for this special end-of-year episode of the Spiked podcast with Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And stand-up comic and Spike columnist Simon Evans.
Good afternoon.
So, this is a conversation that's going to happen in two halves. You're watching the first half now on the Spiked podcast. The second half, you'll have to join us over at Spiked Podcast Unlocked, which is our exclusive podcast for Spike supporters. If you're not a Spike supporter, then sign up now and you can enjoy that. And it's not just exclusive content you'll get. There are plenty of other perks, including a discount on Brendan O'Neill's brand new book, Vibe Shift, which Tom is going to tell you a bit more about.
Absolutely. So as we mentioned on the podcast last week, Brendan O'Neill's forthcoming book, Vibe Shift, is going to be out in the new year. And we're giving away signed copies to anyone who donates to Spiked with £50 or more if you're not a Spiked supporter, or just £30 or more if you are a Spiked supporter. So dig deep this Christmas, fund our work as we go into 2026. And if you give that £50 plus if you're not a supporter, or £30 plus if you are, we'll send one of these in the post. So to find out how you can make your donation and claim yourself one of these, go to spiked-online.com/Xmas.
Censorship is all around us, and beating cancel culture can take a hell of a lot of effort when it rears its head in the real world. But when it comes to online censorship, thankfully there's an easy and effortless way to beat the censors. And that's thanks to our partners, Private Internet Access, or PIA for short. PIA is the VPN that I use and trust whenever I'm accessing the internet. A VPN, or virtual private network, is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet connection through an encrypted tunnel. And it's not just that. Did you know that streaming services like Netflix and Prime Video have huge catalogues of content, but you can only access a tiny fraction of it from your own country? Using PIA to change your location opens up a whole new world of streaming. Paying for Netflix without using PIA is a bit like paying for front row seats at the cinema and being forced to sit in the hallway. PIA is also essential for keeping yourself safe online. It protects you from the prying eyes of hackers, internet service providers, and anyone else who might have an unhealthy interest in your personal information or online activity. Personally, I'd never go online again without it. And because PIA is available for all platforms, I never need to worry about my safety or privacy. It works on Windows, Apple Mac, iPhone, Android, and more. Even better, you only need one subscription to protect yourself across all of those devices. So, sign up now to the world's most transparent VPN provider and take advantage of our special offer. Spiked viewers and listeners can get 86% off a subscription to Private Internet Access. That's just £1.67 a month. And you'll also get an extra 4 months thrown in completely for free. To take advantage of this incredible deal, just go to piavpn.com/spiked. That's piavpn.com/spiked. Signing up is totally risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. You will not regret it. Sign up now at piavpn.com/spiked. So, in this first half of the pod, we're going to be discussing Bondi and the new barbarism, anti-Semitism, Islamism, and we're discussing the crisis of free speech on both sides of the Atlantic. Let's kick off with the Bondi Beach massacre, a really horrific capstone to a grim year of anti-Semitic violence. 15 people killed by a father-son duo of suspected Islamist terrorists. Follows the Heaton Park synagogue massacre in Manchester. It follows the flamethrower attack in Boulder, Colorado. It follows so many disgraceful outbursts of Islamist attacks on Jews. Tom, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Well, at the time of recording, we know that at least 15 people have died, dozens have been injured. and that this is an act of barbarism, which I think has really shocked the world. It did feel like it was heading in this direction, unfortunately, because there has been this build-up of not just a kind of ambient anti-Semitism, graffiti on walls, people intimidated, hate marches in various Western capitals, but also, as you say, blood being spilled, people being injured, in some cases fatally, before this attack. But I think this one has touched a nerve, partly because this is something that's quite unusual for Australia, I suppose, so it's shot that particular country and also reverberated from beyond there. The fact that so much of it, I guess, was caught on video, just the kind of indiscriminate way in which this despicable father-son duo were gunning down people, everyone from Holocaust survivors to 10-year-old girls, indiscriminately, purely because they were gathered to celebrate Hanukkah. And I think it's led people to kind of think the thoughts and prayers response that we usually get from politicians right now really isn't enough, or also the kind of, well, what we need to do is have tighter gun control laws, which has been the discussion in Australia, really isn't enough. It is time for action, but it's time for much more decisive action, particularly because, as you say, this just feels like the capstone, the culmination of violence, intimidation and murder that we've seen against Jews committed by Islamists, in this case, is suspected over the course of the past 12 months.
And Simon, it does just feel like there are still many in the political class that are just in denial that there is a problem with Islamism, that there's a problem with anti-Semitism, there's a problem with terrorism.
Yes, the rhetoric is often bewildering, isn't it, in the immediate aftermath, especially the Prime Minister, the Australian Prime Minister himself, who pivoted immediately towards committing to cracking down on the far right. I mean, unless Islamism is now defined as the far right, which is reasonable, but it's almost certainly not what he intended to say. They talk about anti-Semitism as if it was a general sort of vague something rising like dew, from the earth, as though a natural process that comes and goes and needs to be dealt with, as if it didn't have its origins in one very specific, religious, ethnic quarrel, which has been going on for a long time now. And people are still unwilling to name it, and it's very concerning. And also, you do get, of course, the second and third order effects, which are people like Daniel Finkelstein acknowledging that he no longer feels quite safe in the capital of London, and people go, well, a couple of days ago, Danny, you were saying that London was the safest capital in the world and a wonderful place to be, and that right-wingers like Rupert Lowe, who were flagging up the sense of danger and threat that a lot of people feel on our streets now, was some sort of miasma and possibly a psychological disorder that you should get looked at, and so that then arouses, I think, justified concerns around hypocrisy and so on. I think we need to unite and recognise a common enemy, and I totally understand what you're saying, Tom, in terms of some actual actions, some commitments, whether it be through statute or whether it be through policing, whatever it is. It's quite hard to know exactly what that looks like. And Australia as well is somewhere we have a connection with at home. My wife lived quite close to Bondi for a few years, still has very good friends there. She was going through the WhatsApp messages overnight and making sure everyone was all right. And there is a sense of disbelief there, I think, because they have been, to a very large extent, for better or for worse, sequestered, protected to some extent, in the same way that Musk controversially, referred to the Shires of England as being like hobbits, who have been kept safe from the big, bad, brutal outside world for a long time. I think to some extent, Australia, very much a first world capital, obviously Sydney now, and more so in the online 24-hour digital world, but still has not quite seen anything like this before, and a very rude awakening. The extent to which I think serious questions need to be asked about their police response. There was a police station not very far away, and it was something like 25 minutes before significant action took place. And of course, we all saw the footage of a single private individual, rushing one of the gunmen. And I think they're going to have to wake up and think about what kind of measures they need to have ready and what kind of drills they need to be capable of initiating immediately if this should happen again. I don't know what would happen if a gunman took up a position in Hyde Park or something and started unleashing rounds, but I like to think it would be less than half an hour before there was some sort of response to it,
No, absolutely.
Yeah, certainly. But Tom, I think the main thing is we need a political response. I think that's the thing that's been sorely lacking, because actually, talking about past terror attacks in London, for instance, the police have been generally very impressive and have got on top of those very quickly. But it's the political response that's lacking. Our leaders won't call it an Islamist attack or find ways of avoiding that. Some won't even call it, anti-Semitic, which is even more strange. If we can't even name the threat, how do we begin to tackle it?
No, completely. And I think the broadening out is useful here because of the fact that I think in the discussions within Australia, given the fact they are in so many ways sort of downstream from our own politics and discussions and so on, there's been a lot of questions asked about is what has been visited upon Britain and other countries in Europe kind of finally reaching us. So it's worth remembering what we have been experiencing over the course of the past, more than 20 years now.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the 20th anniversary of 7/7 earlier this year when the most deadly Islamist attack on our shores, 52 people murdered, many more maimed, lives ruined. And when that anniversary was marked, there was a BBC long read, didn't mention the word Islamism or Islam once. You had a statement from King Charles, which just talked about the necessity of us kind of coming together as communities and so on and so forth, as if a kind of hasty interfaith meeting might have averted that horrific terrorist attack. And also there's a kind of clear recognition that whilst individual attacks, individual atrocities might bear particular characteristics, a particular profile, some of them will be homegrown, some of them will be asylum seekers. It's clear that if we're looking for solutions, we should look at the sources of all of this, which is that we have had, this Islamist terrorism, and I think more specifically as well in the context of Bondi, this Islamic anti-Semitism, which is obviously brewed as a result of a series of catastrophic policy failures and virtue signalling gone wrong, porous borders and no concern given to that, multiculturalism constantly accentuating difference and kind of fueling Islamist grievance narratives, the fact that you have the great and good acting as effectively the useful idiots of the Islamist extremists by constantly deflecting, constantly treating Islamist attacks as if they are, as you were alluding to there, Simon, something almost like naturally occurring. There's not much that can be done about them. That's where you start, because it's clearly not purely a policing matter. It's clearly not purely a kind of procedural matter, although those questions always have to be asked. But particularly in a country like Britain, where there's, the last time they seem to estimate it, there were 40,000 suspected Islamist terrorists on the watch list. You're not going to catch all of them. Yeah. And as the old saying goes, they only have to be lucky once. So clearly, this is something which is afflicting Western societies who've seemingly made the same series of mistakes and refuse to own up to them, because doing so would require the ruling class to question a lot of things that they've held dear for quite some time.
Yeah, and it is as if you could go to, pick out most countries in the West and pinpoint the same problem. In Germany last week, 2 separate planned attacks on Christmas markets were foiled. We could talk about other anniversaries. This is the 10-year anniversary of the horrific Charlie Hebdo attack, 10-year anniversary of the Bataclan attack as well, both in Paris. And yet there seems to be a reluctance to even talk about this, and actually a willingness to silence people who do talk about it. I mean, Labour is bringing in, and his definition of what it calls anti-Muslim hostility, because it doesn't want to use the word Islamophobia because that's sort of been discredited. But it feels as if the powers that be would rather people not talk about it than that they're more worried about us complaining about it too much, looking back in anger, so to speak.
I think part of the problem, and I remember in 2015 becoming aware of this, there was open talk at the time of what was believed to be the ISIS or Al-Qaeda strategy, which was to create these outrages so that there would be an overreaction, as it might be understood by Muslim communities in France or Britain or whatever, and they would be forced to choose a side. The idea was that there were too many Muslims in Europe who were happily, peacefully coexisting with Christians and secular society, and they needed to be made aware that ultimately Christian Europe was hostile to them, and that this was going to be sooner or later a battle for civilization, and they needed to pick a side. And so understandably, European establishment figures didn't want that to be a successful strategy. They wanted to downplay that. They wanted to minimize that response. And to some extent, you might say in 2015 it was successful, because I think Nice and with the truck and the Bataclan were in the same year, and as you say, although and I think a lot of people thought, oh my God, what is starting now? Are we entering and actually since then, on average, year by year, it has been calmed down, and the measures taken have been largely successful, and perhaps the heat has been drawn from it. And obviously, I think a significant part of the strategy of October the 7th was to reinitiate that, to elevate that again. to make life difficult for Jews, the diaspora, and there is a tiny little smidgen of suspicion that there are militant Jews within Israel, and maybe even Netanyahu himself, who is not averse to the idea that Jews have to pick a side as well. That, a lot of people find the idea that you can just live side by side with these people and get along, unacceptable. That they have to be forced to pick up a weapon. And so again, I do understand the difficulty, and I understand the challenge that is faced by that, because you don't want to elevate that threat. You don't want Jews living in London or in Sydney to think I either have to now regard myself as being part of a diaspora conflict. I want to just carry on as is. And. Yeah, so I don't know what the solution is, but there is something nevertheless enraging about the obvious refusal to even give it a name at this point. And I do think there is the fact that we've all used the word Islamism, which is intended to suggest that this is a weaponized, politicized version of Islam, and we are trying to distinguish it from peaceful Muslims, is in itself reaching out across that potential misunderstanding.
Yeah.
It's an attempt to make a distinction. But at some point, if you're not willing to make that distinction, if you're not willing to refer to Islamism, then there is the suggestion that actually you don't believe in that distinction, and that actually as a provocateur on Twitter will say, an Islamist is somebody who is willing to use violence in order to propagate Islam. And a Muslim is somebody who is happy to watch Islamists use violence. See what I mean? There's that kind of continuum. You have to break that continuum. You have to be decisive and state that. And then I think to some extent you are acknowledging that the strategy is in play. You are asking people to pick a side, but you are saying if you wish to continue to live in Europe, you have to acknowledge that there is no place here for Islamism. You are welcome to pursue the conscience, your own religion. We have freedom of conscience, but it is not to be used as an organizing principle for terrorism or for for spreading fear in any community.
Tom, let's try to add something.
Well, I just think, just to bring it back to the anti-Semitism question briefly, because that is where we've started with this. And the fact that I completely agree with you, Simon, the way in which October the 7th, clearly part of it was to try and put the tails up of people worldwide who wanted to inflict terror and murder on Jewish people. The number of foiled attacks that we've seen across Europe that have been Hamas linked or linked to other Islamist groups on Jewish sites, on Israeli government property, so on and so forth. It's mind-boggling if you go down the list of that. It's incredible. It's horrible to say that more of them haven't been successful. There's been a string of seemingly kind of Iranian state-backed efforts, which have, thankfully been in large part foiled. But these have just been a constant over the course of the past couple of years. And it's fascinating because when politicians engage in the kind of deflection around the question of Islamic terrorism, radical Islamism, whatever phrase we want to call it, they seem to be doing so because they want to maintain some sense of moral conscience. We don't want to scapegoat this minority. We don't want to do this. We don't want to do that. It's telling that what seems to have got lost in this is that not too long ago, the whole kind of moral conscience of the West was bound up with the sense that this should be a safe place for Jewish people to live in the wake of the Holocaust, in the wake of the greatest crimes against humanity ever committed. It was seen as a key marker of any enlightened society that your Jewish population, however large or small, would not have to face this daily drumbeat of fear. And the fact that so many countries now are failing that test to such a horrific degree that you've got Holocaust survivors being murdered in Australia, having fled to that country, seeking a safety and a better life after experiencing the absolute worst. And that you've also got things like in the run-up to the Bondi Beach attack, there was a firebombing of a synagogue in Melbourne, which was built by Holocaust survivors. All of these, the moral test that had been failed by various Western nations is telling. And they've done it because of the fact that they thought they were being moral somehow.
So they've been good, yeah.
Yeah, and it's untangling that as we go into the next year, and also working out what the solutions are, and having a proper discussion about that, rather than things which are either just airy platitudes or technical fixes which are useful around the edges. That's certainly where the focus is going to be.
So let's talk about free speech on both sides of the Atlantic. I think it'd be useful to talk, first of all, about the murder in September of Charlie Kirk, himself a free speech activist. He was murdered for his words, for his beliefs. Tom, this was the militarization, essentially, of cancel culture.
And it felt like we talked already about this sense of inevitability or sense of culmination, but in that case, I think that was definitely a moment in which all of the horrific implications of a lot of the bogus arguments around freedom of speech and against freedom of speech, which have existed for a very long time, we were shown what the horrific consequences of that could be. If you go around for decades now on university campuses and elsewhere insisting that words are violence, then at some point someone's going to respond to words with violence, and violence so horrific that it went round the world. I mean, I think there was something about that moment which it's talking about kind of taking sides. It really revealed who was sort of on the side of just sort of basic civilizational values and who wasn't. You had people absolutely abhorred by the fact that an individual was assassinated for no other reason that he made arguments. I mean, political assassinations in America, you might previously think about presidents, you might think about political leaders, you might think about many of them, of course, you know, not saying it's justified in any sort of situation necessarily, but what I'm saying is that was a very different type of act. What we're talking about here is what you have said offends me, therefore I will kill you. And if you're looking at the details which have been coming out about Tyler Robinson, the suspect in all of this, the fact that the evidence would suggest that this is quite clearly just straightforwardly politically motivated and articulated very much in the language of the safe space. You know, I can't deal with his hate, the sense that because Charlie Kirk's, you know, opposition to gender ideology makes him fair game because he's inflicted so much alleged harm on trans people. It's very clear where this all came from. And again, I don't think we can be particularly surprised over the course of the past 10 years, and the period in which kind of Charlie Kirk really emerges, 10 to 15 years of the kind of nascent kind of conservative to right-wing pushback on campus against the excesses of political correctness and wokeness and whatnot. You just saw this steady increase in the tension. You know,
Yeah.
it was just about 10 years ago that you had riots at Berkeley when Milo Yiannopoulos was there to speak. It was around that time as well that you saw Charles Murray speaking at Middlebury College, and the female academic who was there to interview him gets assaulted and ends up having to go to hospital. And clearly things were sort of heading in that direction. And it's that core fundamental warping of the idea of freedom of speech, the idea that, and the sense that words can in fact inflict real world harm, has ushered in this sort of new potential era of violence of political violence on the left. I think it's worth saying that, you know, it doesn't look like we're kind of in a kind of late 60s moment. We shouldn't catastrophize about anything like this, but it feels like a Rubicon was crossed there. And I'm not entirely sure that the American body politic has fully digested it yet.
Yeah, Simon, your thoughts on?
Yes, I think, I mean, without the case having been fully heard, there is a temptation to kind of maybe project motivation and mindset and what psychological disturbance was present in Robinson's brain at the time. But I do think it's probably the case that Charlie Kirk was enraging to people of that sort precisely because he was so patient, articulate, civil, respectful with his interlocutors at the events he took to the universities. He had his own podcast and his own gang as well, and some of those podcasts he was a little bit more roguish perhaps with the way he expressed some of his views. But on those campus events, he was extraordinarily patient. He was extraordinarily kind and considerate. And even, although one of the quotes that's always attributed to him is that he doesn't like the word empathy, meaning only that he prefers sympathy and compassion, which are more old-fashioned words. But he genuinely seemed to have a lot of empathy for the struggles that young people have to make sense of the world, and you know how difficult it is to maybe start a family now or whatever, and whether or not that's something that you should, you know, take the risk of even attempting now. And those are the people that inevitably attract the attention of assassins because they are infuriating. You know, if he had just been some kind of old-fashioned TV evangelist, you know, spouting fire and brimstone and the prospect of hell because you were trans or gay, I don't think he would probably have met that fate. But it was horrible, and it was particularly horrible, obviously, because it was caught on camera. It was particularly horrible because almost immediately, and even within some sort of WhatsApp chats, of which I'm a member and was quite shocked to see, people were sharing quotations attributed to him, taken out of context, which was sort of presented as though, if not quite justifying his death, at least going some way to explain why he, casting doubt on whether he believed that a black female pilot could ever be considered competent, rather than what he was doing, which was critiquing what was downstream of DEI and so on. It's easy if somebody speaks as much as he does to find a few quotes that will make them look like a demon, but he absolutely was not, in my view. And I've clashed with some fairly major sort of, establishment figures such as Oliver Cam, who was an ex-Times leader writer, who was promulgating these out-of-context quotations as proving that he was quite, a racist beyond the pale and so on, and obviously not, justifying his death again. Nobody would do that, but it was grim. It was very, very grim to see that, and I think a lot of us as well, I certainly say myself, were genuinely quite troubled by it. It was a horrible thing to see happen, and those few occasions when any public figure, is taken that quickly, and you find yourself catching up with the information on a regular basis for the next few days, nasty. Also, one thing that a lot of people said at the time is Charlie Kirk was the moderate option and wait and see what comes next, and that could have been hollow rhetoric. But I can't help thinking the rise since then of Nick Fuentes, might have been a different proposition if it hadn't been for that. He and Fuentes clashed quite openly, and Fuentes felt he was too moderate and felt that he was too friendly to Israel and so on. And Fuentes is now gathering momentum and traction, and that may well be partly to do with that.
We'll definitely come back to Fuentes and some of the online right characters later on in the discussion. Should we talk about Graham Linehan? I mean, that seemed to be the whole world's eyes actually has been on, the UK's free speech crisis. But I feel like this case, more than any other, has captured people's attention. A comedy writer, a writer of classics like Father Ted, arrested as soon as he lands on British soil at Heathrow. 5 armed guards come to take him away to interrogate him for 3 tweets, basically just making fun of trans activism. So I think, if people were not alive to the crisis of free speech in Britain, to the fact that you can be a thought criminal in 2025, this was the case that surely should have shaken them out of that complacency.
No, absolutely. And I think it was the almost accidental optics of it which really hammered that home. The fact that you had Graham Linehan coming back from America under the First Amendment to arrive back in Heathrow Airport, Britain, which, as everyone knows, is now the land of the speech police, and to be immediately arrested by armed police and then interrogated really hammered it home. Of course, police at Heathrow tend to be armed, so that was sort of incidental. But you couldn't have asked for a more dystopian image of how far we've fallen where freedom of speech is concerned. And it was really interesting to see the consequences of it. We knew that this was going to, or I suppose it's not surprising that it made a lot of headlines in America, where, as you say, our ridiculous to quite sinister situation where state censorship is concerned, has become a real factor in the American culture war and even kind of transatlantic diplomacy in a fascinating way this year. But the fact that it actually prompted at least semi-serious response from the political class was something that's probably worth dwelling on. I don't think it will turn into anything, but almost immediately after that happened, you had various leading Labour frontbenchers, Wes Streeting and so on, saying that quite clearly we need to look again at these laws. You had Sir Mark Rowley, Metropolitan Police Chief, saying that, again, we police shouldn't be in the business of refereeing the culture war effectively. Now, of course, were any repeal of legislation or change to police practice forthcoming? Obviously not. Certainly not ones that were any significant. I believe the Met said that they would stop investigating non-crime hate incidents, but they would still record them. Yep. I don't really know what that means, but it sounds like it's not particularly positive. But yes, I think it was so egregious an example. It allowed everyone to take a bit of a step back. Perhaps there's an opening there that can be exploited as we go into the new year. But as ever, it feels like these stories come and go, and then not much change will come until this government goes, really, which, if anything, on free speech, as we all know, is heading in the other direction.
Simon, as a comedian, do you ever worry that you might have the thought police come to your door one day?
Yes. Yeah, probably not for anything I'd say on stage, but occasionally you tweet something or you post something or retweet something, and you do wonder if this, passes the Alison Pearson test, at least, And occasionally you can, do something rashly that without maybe investigating its validity. I mean, the timing was fantastic, wasn't it? Because especially on social media and especially through Elon Musk in particular, essentially again and again, but also J.D. Vance, raising the spectre of Britain as having fallen, essentially, as having become a sort of Stasi-infested, like a prison island. Free speech is dead. We are in authoritarian. In 1984 is a manual, all the rest of it. And people can, Keir Starmer kind of go, oh, come on, don't be ridiculous. And then 5 armed police arrest Graham Linehan. Linehan, obviously, you can't just say he's not just a comedy writer. Obviously, he has been a gender-critical activist or whatever, how you want to describe it, for a long time. And that has become his sort of full-time occupation, sadly, and he's not had much time to write comedy, and one hopes he is going to be able to steer it back onto that. But it was still absurdly over the top, and I was really frustrated, to be honest, with Sir Mark Rowley's, we police shouldn't be, caught in that. But you can make choices. Anyone can make choices. There are thousands of crimes which are reported every day, which the police go, I'm sorry, we just don't have the resources to look into that. My bike's been nicked. I know where it is. It's got a tracker. I'm sorry, we don't have time. But this fella shows up at the airport, and because somebody knows how to game the system, because somebody knows how to put the pressure points on, and of course, yes, at the airport, I believe police are generally armed or whatever. That's how, I don't think they were armed specifically because it was Linehan. But still, the optics could not have been more profoundly in Musk's favour. And it was a huge amount of egg on the government's face. And I hope it does kind of ultimately. But I think you're right. We won't see any legislation going in the other direction. What we will still see, I think, at this point is most likely a reform landslide. And this will be a major factor in it, which is in itself troubling. I actually personally, from what I understand, reforms, economic agenda and so on is starting to become more fully fleshed out. And I know some people who know what they're talking about, who think that they are actually capable of putting together a competent team and so on. But you should not have governments changing hands over something so fundamentally sort of trivial and yet obvious, and at the same time. You know what I mean? This is not complicated. It's not like trying to balance the budget. It's not like trying to regrow the economy or get productivity up. Those are very, very difficult things. Having a police force that don't arrest comedians for naughty tweets is not a difficult task. That is a very low bar. And if this government can't get over that, then they will lose. But it's a stupid way to go.
Yeah, but it does feel like the political class across the world has to be dragged kicking and screaming into that common sense position.
Yeah.
Because, in the past recent years, we of course had the Scottish Hate Crime Act. If the trend is for more censorship, not less, throughout most of the world. America.
The weird thing is, though, to some extent, I think that some of that censorship is in a reaction to the realization that the multicultural project is not going as smoothly as we'd hoped, and that they are trying to stifle any expression of, and that obviously with the Southport riots and so on. But the trans thing is just insane. You should be allowed to say whatever you want, frankly, but not obviously to call for violence, but any opinion that you have. That is like there's just no justification for the police getting involved in any of that ever.
Yeah, 12,000 people arrested every year. Tom, it's talked about Linehan, but there are so many other cases we could dwell on that just absolutely shame this country.
Yeah, and people should watch Think Before You Post, our documentary on. Yeah. It's very subject to see 3 eye-opening case studies therein. I mean, this is something now that has become a live political issue in a way that I think could actually be quite fruitful. I mean, we at Spite, other people who have been in this fight for a long time, have been raging against the hate speech laws, the communications offences, pointing out the combination of how absurd and sinister they are, and how if you want to live in a free society, you cannot have the state taking it upon themselves to decide what is hate, what is offensive, what is grossly offensive. I mean, this is ultimately always going to be a race to the bottom. And I think we've also been shown that it becomes essentially a political weapon, even if not directly by the government, then by well-connected activist groups or individuals who know how to press the right buttons to get the police to respond in a certain way. You can tell that that's certainly been Graham's, lot over the course of the past few years. One thing I think would, the fact that it's now being talked about, the fact that it's now international news can, in a sense, only be a good thing. I mean, it had to get worse before it got better, I suppose. And I think what will almost certainly happen is at the time of the next election, both Reform and the Conservatives, and whether or not they end up in some kind of alliance is now a much more live political question. will be committed to quite serious repeal of these things, not because it's and that's something that is also relatively straightforward to do. You're not, it's there'll be a few I's to dot and T's to cross and what have you, but repealing section 127 of the Communications Act is not a grand undertaking, but I think it will have tremendous symbolic importance, and also importance to anyone who cares about freedom of speech. So even if there are many issues in the world today, I think the reason this one has connected with a lot of people is because it's resonated with their sense that the world is gone bananas, and also that the state is really not on their side. And I think those two things together has made it much more potent than it has been for all the time that we've been writing about it.
So that's the end of our first half of the conversation. But if you want to join us for the second half of our look back on 2025, where we will be talking about the rise of reform, the migrant crisis, the flag wars, whether woke is at an end, then join us over on Spiked Podcast Unlocked, which is exclusive for Spike supporters.
There's still plenty of people who convince themselves that woke is simply a question of just be nice to people. It's not that. It's a cult.
So if you're not a Spike supporter, then please sign up now by going to spiked-online.com/support, and then join us over at Spike Podcast Unlocked. Thank you so much for watching the Spike Podcast, and thank you to our friends at Private Internet Access for sponsoring us. Now's the time to take control of your digital life and get PI8 for 86% off. Click the link in the description below or scan the QR code. And remember, if you're a Spiked supporter, then this episode isn't over yet. You can now watch the Spiked Podcast Unlocked. Just go to the Spiked website, log in, and you'll see it on the homepage. So join us right now.